Hello, my name's Gavin and this is Genre Books, and when there's a reading event on, as there is at the moment, if I can, possibly, I will try to shoehorn a pulp magazine into the mix. With June on the Range, there are Western pulps, horror mayhem, weird or horror pulps. Summer of Sport, there are sports pulps. Rocket Summer, obviously, plenty of science fiction pulps. Garbaugust is, I think, the only option I will have to turn to something which I've not read before, which is the spicy pulps. I don't own any spicy pulps, so I turned to the Internet Archive and chose one at random. So this is Spicy Stories from September 1933. And there's some interesting things to talk about with spicy pulps, but there's not a lot to talk about with any level of detail. I'll briefly go through some of the stories in this magazine, but there's not a lot of background information. I can't find anything on these authors. These are not names I've heard of. I doubt that these are their actual names in the vast majority of cases. The editor wasn't mentioned in the magazine. I think once pulp magazines had come onto the market, there was only a matter of time before something along the lines of spicy pulps entered into the fray. If you're going to have a market for westerns, adventures, romances, sports, science fiction, mysteries, and horror, sex is going to get into there somehow. And a modicum of titillation invades all of those other titles, except perhaps the sports genre, where things are pretty straight-laced. But other than the romance pulps, it's never a focus, and with the romance pulps, things are much more demure, coy. Spicy pulps are titillating, but certainly get coy at a certain point. There are still rules if you want to be able to sell your finished product. There's obviously a line somewhere, and it's a line that is stepped over on more than one occasion or retrospectively punished. Early titles such as Snappy Stories and Pep lead the way for others, and in particular a publisher that produces ginger stories, spicy stories. I think Broadway Nights, Gay Paris, there's a plethora of titles. Some markets in the United States are more restrictive than others. In the letters page of the issue of Spicy Stories that I read, one correspondent bemoans the fact that he is unable to get issues of the magazine in his city and relies on help from outside of the state. When the magazines are sent by post, they have to come up with at least a modicum of decency, a line beyond which they will not cross, to still be carried by the government. And the stories in the magazines have what would be deemed immoral behaviour. They have nudity. But they'll only have female nudity, and things are still left to the reader's imagination beyond a certain point. Of course, this will never satisfy some arbiters of decency. There is a level of self-censorship that goes on in the industry and in the retail of these magazines as well. Most newsstands and shops will stock the titles, they will sell the titles, but it will be strictly under the counter. In 1932, the New York Committee on Civic Decency intervened, put pressure on the police to arrest 4 newsstand vendors who are flagrantly displaying these titles and not selling them under the counter. A deal is struck with the publishers to cancel some titles straight away and to soften the material in the remainder of the titles. The publishers had been hit by this point and were unable to get over the Great Depression, and some of the titles that were shut would probably have been shutting anyway and were used as sacrificial lambs. Once the spice is toned down, there is, for a certain market, less appeal in the magazines. And a way to increase the appeal, they started mixing other genres with the spice. So we see spicy western, spicy adventure, spicy detective, spicy mystery. This has the added bonus of allowing the magazines to produce writing by some more famous names and perhaps stories that these writers were producing that were a little too risque for the straight pulps, but with this spicy bent they now have an outlet. So we see works by Robert E. Howard, E. Hoffman Price, H.P. Lovecraft, Robert Leslie Bellamy, Hugh B. Cave, Henry Kuttner, interspersed with the normal cadre of spicy writers. And it's fairly easy to see the attraction. They have stories that they can't sell anywhere else, and some of the pulps pay a premium. Spicy Stories at its height and before the Great Depression was paying 1.5 cents a word. By 1933, 1934 that had dropped to 1 cent a word, but this was still higher than some of the other outlets for people's writing. And it really hasn't harmed the reputation of any of those more established writers, because no one really reads the spicy pulps any longer. Their more famous stories have been anthologized and turned into comics and films and God knows what else, and no one reads these 90-year-old magazines any longer. So the industry rubs along quite well in this regard for a few years until the pillars of civic decency have their hackles raised again and want to take even more draconian measures. Voluntarily, one of the publishers who produces spicy western, spicy adventure, etc., he wants to become more respectable himself. He is branching out into other areas of publishing, comics for example, and self-censors. Does this not so much in the material within the magazine, but changes the titles' names. So we don't have spicy detective, spicy mystery, spicy adventure, spicy western. They become speed detective, speed mystery, speed western. I'm not quite sure who they thought they were fooling. The magazines still had scantily clad, often restrained women on the front cover, and changing the title of the magazine doesn't do an awful lot. However, lots of the pulp magazines had scantily clad women on the front cover. Weird Tales, certainly not averse to that. Many of the science fiction pulps, some crazy and impractical outfits for space travel. But let's talk about spicy stories. The publication began in 1928, so we're already 5 years into the run by the time we get to the issue that I'm looking at, and it ran for 117 issues. So it doesn't do too bad in the longevity stakes compared to many other pulp magazines. The formula, if this issue is anything to go by for the stories, is pretty basic. The men are not often described at all, except by the female characters who comment on how handsome they are. The men will always retain some semblance of dress. The women often, at the drop of the hat, drop everything else. The women are bored housewives or flighty debutantes. And most importantly, none of this could be published today. Certainly not in a mainstream magazine. The stories, they are fairly tame. I mean, this is 1933. They do have some kind of code, even unwritten, to adhere to. So a lot is left to the reader's imagination. But in the scenarios it leaves for the reader's imagination, the readers don't need a lot of imagination to imagine what happens next. The one thing that surprised me reading the magazine is the fact that there were actual photos, and photos of naked ladies. I've edited those photos for the sake of decency here, and I would give the same words of admonishment to anyone who is getting a little excited by these or is outraged that these things could be published, and that is to say, don't worry, all these women are now dead. I'm actually more outraged by the fact that these women aren't even credited. I think we have the photographer's name scrawled in a corner, but I think these ladies have taken the money and run. They're not in a position to do this under a pseudonym, because you can totally see who they are. So not naming them at all seems to be the next best option. So a longer preamble than I would normally give to these deep dives, and that's because I cannot dive deeply into these stories. All of these writers are unfamiliar to me. I would imagine the majority of them are pseudonyms. I cannot find any information out about the writers. I'm sure there will be a way of doing it had I the time and resource to do so. But the normal places I look either don't talk about the spicy pulps, as they do about all the other pulp genres, or where they do, they have no information about the writers. And I would think once you got into the 40s and the 50s, things are getting a little bit more conservative, a little bit more restrictive. People wouldn't want to advertise that this is what they were doing in the early 30s. So we have the bylines, And we have the stories. And the first story is Marriage License by Charles B. McRae and Frank K. Young. Natalie Kruger has something of a conscience, but is entertaining a gentleman friend and toying with the idea of an affair. Her husband is away on business, or so she thinks. Barry, the wooer, takes Natalie to a nightclub where I think this must still be in the time of Prohibition, or certainly set in the time of Prohibition, because they have a ginger ale and dance into the night. On the drive home, she spies a car that looks suspiciously like her husband's parked elsewhere. So this is an odd story. Natalie half-heartedly struggles with her conscience throughout, and is absolved by the narrative, and what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander, so it all turns out happy for everybody involved, presumably. It is difficult to say because almost all of these stories are left open-ended for fairly obvious reasons. The next story is Goldie by Claire Kennedy, and it is a young man, fresh out of college, son of an industrialist, falls for a Broadway chorus girl or singer, or something to do with the theatre, so immoral straight away. And she is not set in the world of the strictures of alcohol temperance. Quite the reverse, in fact. He actually becomes a little upset about this if she doesn't. He adores her physically, but unless she curbs her drinking somewhat, how is he ever going to present her to society, present her to his family? He gives her something of an ultimatum. She laughs in his face and he leaves. She calls a lawyer friend, concocts the story that he had pledged his hand in marriage and has welched on the deal. The lawyer, who is not doing this out of the goodness of his own heart, decides that what they'll do is they'll go to the wealthy father. And the wealthy father takes an immediate shine to Goldie. The next story is Dusk to Dawn by Kay Carroll, which, I say story, there's not much of a story here at all. It begins with two women, two wives, sunbathing in the nude, and ends with a drunken night of wife swapping. Nat Barker, her story is Those Country Gals! ! So if I don't get to any others, I'm going to use that exclamation mark to mark off the appropriate box on my Garbingo card. Jack is unhappy to be leaving the city and his steady girlfriend to spend the summer in the country with an uncle. He feels he'll be bored in the country, and that is until he meets his uncle's stepdaughter, Mary, who is the country gal of the title, and there's not much of a story here. Girl meets boy. The next story does have a bit more of a narrative around it, and that is Honeymoon Dessert by Gail West and Betsy Ash. I don't know how many of these writers are actually women, but lots of them seem to have women's names. I don't know if this was a fig leaf, a distraction, or whether I'm overthinking it, and one of the routes to writing spicy stories is maybe a traditional romance pulp story that just goes a little bit too risque. But this story has doppelgangers, kidnappings, and seduction, and attempted extortion, and a woman who gets away scot-free. The kidnapping plot is a complete failure. There's also mild lesbianism, a private plane, and cookery. So it crams a lot into the 10 pages or so of the story. It's difficult to say that any of these are well written. Everything is pretty signposted where it's going. There are attempts at flourishes of prose, and there are an incredible amount of ways to describe breasts. A lot of the adjectives are more confusing than arousing, but at least someone's trying. There are only 2 stories left in the magazine. This is another feature I found in Spicy Stories. It's about half the length of other pulp magazines that I've read, and probably a fifth of the length of the Weird Stories anniversary issue that I read. But there's only 2 stories. One of those stories I did not read because it was part 3. I had not read parts 1 and 2. But the last self-contained story was Little Devil by Gerard Revel. That sounds very posh and foreign. And this is a story of a young woman on holiday with lots of other young people at a mountain retreat. They're going to some lavish party and weekend away, and she goes up the mountain to go skinny dipping in a lake because it's so very hot. And quelle surprise, a man comes along who says he owns the land and espies her and doesn't want to stop espying her. She runs away in high dudgeon, clutching her clothes, doesn't stop her going back that night to the same pool to go skinny dipping again. She has an encounter in the dark. She then attends tennis the next day, as you do, and finds that someone that she doesn't like has a cigarette case that she had lost on the shore of the lake, and wonders exactly who she had the encounter with the previous night. I don't think it's any surprise to anyone that all this does resolve itself. But these are uncomplicated stories. They are not particularly engaging, and they have not dated well. Maybe this is because we've become slightly inured to the language, and there will be far more salacious material out there these days. The bits that make you uncomfortable are the attitudes. It's not the attitude that people had a problem with at the time. And I'm not talking about the immoral attitude that people did have a problem with. What I have a problem with, and I think what modern readers would have a problem with, is just the idea of consent. It's bad enough that you have some men, some male characters in this magazine that are too presumptive and won't take no for an answer. What is worse is that the women in the stories who initially are saying no, the presumption is that they don't mean it. The narrators think that they don't mean it. In the characters' own heads, they don't really mean it. They are going through the motions of being coy and virtuous, but in effect are, just as much up for it as the male characters are. And this, I think, is the reason I wouldn't want young people to read the magazine. Not the titillation, not the nudity. But here I am, applying morals from our own time on a magazine produced 91 years ago. I'm not going to say that I'm not going to read any more spicy pulps. They're probably not going to be at the top of my list. And I think what I will want to do is not read so much of the stuff around this particular era anymore. I think I've got the idea of what goes on in these magazines. I would like to maybe look at some of the much earlier magazines before the New York Committee on Civic Decency got on their high horse in 1932. And I'd also like to see some of the later titles, the Spicy Western, the Spicy Adventure, where we have, I think, probably more established and better writers dipping their toes into the spicy market. But that might have to wait until another Garbaugust, until someone comes up with Smut Timber or something like that. But until then,